I'm Andrew Hendel,
And I'm Father Zach Swantek.
and we are right now in the Guidance Counselor Conference Room, and this is the Trimester 1 final interview. On a scale of very good, good, poor, very poor, how would you rate your knowledge of the Bible?
I would say very good because I've read the entire Bible, I've studied it, and I've prayed with it. But at the same time, I'd say that you can always go deeper into it, and there's so much more I can learn.
How important is the question of method in interpreting Scripture?
I think it's very important because we all come and approach Scripture from different perspectives, and so we need to be careful that we don't want to read it with a kind of fundamentalist approach where it's just looking at Scripture literally, because that could be confusing at times, or confusing when confronting science. And although the literal sense is the foundation of all other understandings of Scripture, so it is important. But also we have to be careful not to read it from a relativistic point of view in which we can just interpret the truth to match our own idea of truth, because then we're just really thinking our own thoughts and not God's thoughts. And the historical critical method is helpful because we can look at the way that the people at the time that it was written, how they would have perceived these things, and that can lead us deeper into understanding Scripture. But we don't want to be locked into it, because we have to remember that Scripture is divinely inspired, so there's something much more than the literal sense of that or the historical sense, but there's something spiritual about it to understand as well.
Do you know of any contradictions in the Genesis creation accounts between themselves?
Well, you have these two accounts in Genesis of the creation of the world and of humanity, and they mostly are not to be contradictory, but to give us two kind of snapshots, two understandings of the creation. But one thing about it would be that in the first creation account, which is actually a more new creation account, the Eloist account, you have the kind of a step-by-step account of how God's creating, where he says, "Let there be light," and then he goes each step, but he seems to pause before the creation of man, and then creates them male and female. He created them. And but in the second account, the more older account, the Yahwist account, you have the creation of first just man and not male and female. But this isn't just man, male, it's just humanity. And then it's later they're separate, they're created male and female, Ish and Isha. And so you have this this kind of like a slow motion account, and where you see in greater detail what's happening in the account. So while they're different, they're not supposed to be, well, one is true or one is the other is true, but that from this we have two understandings of the same truth to help us get a reality that's so great that we couldn't understand it just from kind of one snapshot. So it's giving us different pictures.
Do you believe that truth cannot contradict truth?
Sure. With the principle of non-contradiction, it's impossible to believe in two things that are contradictory at the same time. So there can only be one truth, and so if there's something true in Catholicism and Christianity, then it must be true for everything. So science should be able to go hand in hand with it, and that's why St. John Paul II says faith and reason are like two wings in which we can soar to the truth. So they can go together.
How do you interpret the so-called texts of terror in Scripture?
Well, these are texts that if they're read out of context or even in context can be very confusing to us, because it seems that there's the killing of innocent people, and so it would seem that how are we supposed to look at this? And people could say, well, is this supposed to be what religion's about or what God's about? But again, we have to look at Scripture in different senses, and there's the literal sense and the spiritual sense. And so from the literal sense, we may say, did this happen historically or not? Perhaps, perhaps not. I'm not an expert on this, but then to also ask on the spiritual sense, what does that mean? And there's different senses of spiritual sense. There's the moral sense, there's the analogical sense, where we can say, how does this point to Christ? And really, we can't read anything in Scripture, Old Testament or New. All of it should be read in light of Christ. And then also the anagogical sense of understanding, how does this help us understand our final destiny with God in heaven for eternity? And I think that in these more difficult texts, especially perhaps in the anagogical sense, or maybe the moral sense, we could say, well, when they say that they dedicated this city to God and then killed all the people and the animals and all the different things there, what it's saying is that when we dedicate our lives to God, we need to kill or eliminate all that's in our life that's taking us away from God, all that separates us from God, all the sin, and to eliminate it completely so there's no trace left. Whereas they say to put the ban on it, to just completely remove sin from our lives. And I think that can help us understand that perhaps maybe the truth of it was that not all these people and cows and all this were really killed. Maybe that didn't happen, but what they want to say is that when we're converting to God, that it must be complete.
What can faith communities do to better educate their members of the Bible?
Well, I think first, from a priest perspective, that priests, when they're preaching in the Mass, should be able to not just preach their own ideas, but start from Scripture, and the Scripture that the Church gives us, because there's something very rich there, and explain it, but it's not just teaching like in class, but to link it with the liturgy to help us better worship and know God. But then also that in parishes we should have more opportunities for Scripture study and Bible study, and also for religious education for young youth groups, young adult groups, that they too can do study of Scripture so that they can understand it on a deeper level, perhaps in school also, because there's the risk of knowing Scripture a little bit but not knowing it well, and then when coming into contact with society or people who take Scripture out of context, or perhaps even taking classes at a non-Catholic university on Scripture, it might cause them to doubt these things, and they need to know that there is a way to interpret Scripture in light of the 2,000-year teachings of the Church, because there's something very profound there and enriching.
Well, that's all. Thank you, Brother Zach.
All right, thank you.